Today, an investigation into Prince Harry and Meghan Markle's revolting hospital stunt where young children suffering from terminal cancer in some cases were used as props, were put at health risk in order to kick off this fake royal tour. Now, and I think we've really got to start looking at whether the Sussexes and the Sussex team should be held formally responsible for the way that these patients were used.
A formal investigation has now been demanded. A written complaint has been lodged with Australian health authorities. And the organization behind that complaint, Beyond Australia, is asking the questions that much of the mainstream media has, until now, been either unwilling or unable to ask. What happened inside the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne during Harry and Meghan's Australian tour was not a spontaneous and warm engagement between two caring public figures and a group of sick children. It was a staged event, a managed photo opportunity, a carefully constructed scene that placed seriously ill children, some of them receiving treatment for terminal cancer, in a crowded, publicly visible setting for the explicit purpose of generating favorable images for the couple's ongoing image rehabilitation campaign.
I mean, think about it. If you were to go to these parents and say, hey, Meghan Markle is going to be here and she is going to be selling her clothes. She's going to wear an outfit that you are going to meet her in.
And according to the formal complaint now lodged with the relevant authorities, what took place inside that hospital may have constituted a serious and actionable breach of patient dignity, informed consent, and the safeguarding obligations owed to vulnerable minors. The complaint, submitted by Beyond Australia and addressed to the appropriate regulatory commission, is precise and unsparing in its language. It states clearly that publicly available material suggests that seriously ill children were involved in a highly visible and publicized interaction.
Because everything that they do is a lie. They just want to be victims. They don't care that it's a lie. They just I just want to be a victim. Can I just say what happened to me and my victimhood? Like, they just are so all over the place. Nothing
was fully informed, freely given, and appropriately documented. The complaint goes further, asking whether the best interests and well-being of the children were the primary consideration when permission was granted for the visit, and whether sufficient safeguards were implemented to mitigate any potential psychological, emotional, or physical impact on patients. These are not rhetorical questions. They are formal regulatory inquiries, submitted in writing, requesting a documented response from the hospital and from the Victorian health authorities responsible for overseeing the standards to which the hospital is held. The complaint identifies a specific and deeply troubling detail that elevates this matter beyond the realm of ordinary public criticism and into the territory of potential institutional failure. It notes that the apparent integration of patient interaction within a public-facing engagement gives rise to concern that the high threshold of ethical and clinical governance required for activities of this nature may not have been adequately met. In plain terms, what Beyond Australia is saying is this: the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne may have allowed its most vulnerable patients, children receiving treatment for serious, and in some cases terminal illness, to be used as props in a publicity exercise without ensuring that the consent process was robust, transparent, or genuinely informed. And if that is true, then the responsibility for what happened does not rest solely with Harry and Meghan and their team. It rests also with the hospital administrators who opened their doors and their wards to this exercise without adequate scrutiny of what they were actually agreeing to. And that question, the question of informed consent, becomes considerably more complex and considerably more disturbing when you introduce a detail that has received far less attention than it deserves from the mainstream media coverage of this tour. Meghan Markle was wearing a specific outfit during her visit to the Royal Children's Hospital. That outfit, within hours of the hospital visit taking place, appeared for sale on Meghan's new commercial website. The visit to a ward full of cancer patients was, in other words, also a product launch. The photographs taken of Meghan interacting with sick children, photographs that were intended to project compassion, warmth, and humanitarian concern, were simultaneously functioning as promotional content for a commercial clothing enterprise. The parents who brought their children to that hospital, who agreed to allow their children to meet Harry and Meghan, were consenting to what they understood to be a charitable and goodwill visit by two well-known public figures. There is no indication that any of them were informed that the woman walking through the ward in a carefully selected outfit was wearing that outfit for commercial purposes, or that images generated during the visit would be used to drive traffic and sales to a lifestyle brand. The question of whether consent given without that knowledge can be considered genuine, meaningful, or legally valid is one that the formal investigation, now being requested by Beyond Australia, will need to address directly. The hospital stunt, as it has become known among critics of the couple, was in many respects the defining moment of the entire Australian tour. But it did not occur in isolation. It was the opening act of a 4-day exercise that became progressively more revealing as the days went on, exposing in increasingly clear terms the gap between the public persona Harry and Meghan have spent years constructing and the reality of who they are and what they are doing. By the time the tour reached its conclusion, the couple had managed to unite commentators across the political spectrum, from the left and from the right, from Britain and from America, in a shared assessment that what they had witnessed over the course of the week was not a humanitarian mission, but a commercial operation dressed up in the language of charity and public service. Among those who spoke out with the greatest force and the greatest specificity was Megyn Kelly, the American broadcaster and former NBC News anchor, whose willingness to pursue uncomfortable truths about powerful public figures has made her one of the most watched and most cited voices in this particular debate. Kelly's analysis of Meghan Markle's tour was not primarily emotional or rhetorical. It was evidentiary. It was built on a foundation of documented facts, verified timelines, and direct quotations, the approach of a trained prosecutor, which is precisely what Kelly was before she became a television journalist. And what that approach produced was a dismantling of the victimhood narrative that Meghan had spent so much of the Australian tour constructing, piece by piece, claim by claim, with a methodical thoroughness that left very little room for reasonable disagreement. Kelly's central argument was straightforward. Meghan Markle is not a victim of the public's attention. She is someone who deliberately and calculatingly sought that attention, who identified Prince Harry as a pathway to the kind of global fame and influence she had been unable to achieve through her acting career, and who pursued that pathway with a clarity of purpose and a sophistication of execution that is entirely incompatible with the narrative of an innocent woman overwhelmed by forces beyond her control. The vision board, that detail, the fact that Harry had reportedly appeared on Meghan's vision board before they began dating, as a named and specific target rather than as a vague aspiration toward success, goes to the heart of the authenticity question that has followed Meghan throughout her time in the public eye. She has denied it. She has constructed an alternative narrative in which she knew nothing about the royal family and had no particular interest in Harry before their relationship began. Kelly, who broke the original story and stands by her sourcing, was direct and unambiguous. The denial is false. The vision board was real, and the implications of that reality for everything Meghan has subsequently said about her own story are significant. Kelly also addressed the specific claim that Meghan made at Swinburne University, the claim that is perhaps the most brazen and the most easily challenged of all the assertions made during the Australian tour, the claim of being the most trolled person in the entire world, man or woman, for 10 consecutive years, every single day. Kelly's response to this claim was to place it in its proper context, and that context is one that the mainstream media has been conspicuously reluctant to supply. Meghan Markle became a public figure by choice. She sought out and successfully secured a relationship with one of the most famous men alive. She leveraged that relationship to achieve a level of global celebrity that her previous career had not generated. And having done all of that, having made every choice that placed her in the public eye, having pursued every opportunity that kept her there, she now presents the inevitable consequences of those choices as something that was done to her, rather than something that resulted from decisions she made freely and deliberately. The trolling claim also contains within it a contradiction that Harry himself inadvertently exposed during the same week of the Australian tour, and the significance of that contradiction has been almost entirely overlooked by the media outlets that covered the tour favorably. Harry, speaking at the Entourage Summit in Melbourne, made comments about attending therapy during the period when Meghan was pregnant with Archie. He described struggling with feelings of detachment and stress during that pregnancy, and he framed his decision to seek therapeutic support as part of a broader journey toward mental health and self-awareness. Now consider what Meghan has previously said about that same period. She has stated, in interviews that received worldwide attention and generated enormous amounts of sympathetic coverage, that during her pregnancy she was suicidal, that she had asked for help and been refused, that she and Harry had been left isolated and abandoned, with no institutional support and no one to turn to. The two accounts cannot both be true. If Harry was in therapy during Meghan's pregnancy, as he himself has now confirmed, then the claim that they had no support and no one to turn to is false. It was always implausible. It is now, by Harry's own inadvertent admission, demonstrably untrue. And the mainstream media, which devoted enormous resources to amplifying the original claim when it was first made, has shown remarkably little interest in following up on this new and highly relevant piece of information. Trevor Phillips, the broadcaster and former chairman of the Equality and Human Rights Commission, was among those who added their voice to the growing chorus of criticism from the political left. Phillips is not a natural ally of those who have made royal commentary their primary area of focus. He is a serious and respected figure in British public life, and his willingness to speak critically about Harry and Meghan carries particular weight precisely because it cannot be dismissed as the product of conservative bias or tabloid resentment. His assessment of the Australian tour was unsparing, and his critique focused specifically on the couple's use of victimhood rhetoric as a substitute for genuine accountability. The reaction of ordinary Australians to the tour was also telling, and also largely underreported. The crowds were thin. The enthusiasm was limited. The social media response, even in a country where the royal family still carries significant cultural resonance, was dominated not by affection or excitement, but by skepticism, irritation, and in many cases outright hostility. Footage from Meghan's walkabout in Melbourne showed a moment that crystallized the gap between the managed narrative and the observable reality. A member of Meghan's team visibly signaling to members of the public to give her more space, in the middle of what was supposed to be a warm and spontaneous engagement with ordinary Australians. The image of a team managing public access to a woman who claims to want authentic connection with real people is one that those who saw it found difficult to reconcile with the humanitarian framing of the entire exercise. The commercial dimension of the tour deserves more sustained attention than it has received. Meghan's new lifestyle website, which was launched in close proximity to the Australian trip, operates as a platform for selling and promoting products that Meghan herself wears during public appearances. The model is elegant in its simplicity. Meghan appears at a public event wearing a specific item of clothing. Photographs are taken and widely distributed. The clothing appears for sale on the website. Consumers who have seen the photographs and been drawn to the item can purchase it directly. The Australian tour, with its multiple public appearances, its extensive media coverage, and its carefully chosen and impeccably photographed outfits, provided an ideal and extraordinarily cost-effective marketing campaign for this commercial enterprise. The hospital visit, the university speech, the walkabout in Melbourne, the appearance at the women's refuge, each of these engagements, framed publicly as humanitarian acts, also functioned as promotional events for a business. And the people who participated in those engagements, the sick children, the university students, the women at the refuge, did so without, as far as anyone has been able to establish, any awareness of the commercial context within which their participation was taking place. The pantyhose moment, which might under other circumstances be dismissed as a trivial fashion observation, deserves mention precisely because it illustrates something important about the relationship between Meghan's public statements and her actual behavior. She had previously described being required to wear pantyhose during her time as a working royal as something that felt inauthentic, a small but telling symbol, in her own framing, of the constraints that royal life had placed on her ability to express her true self. And yet during the Australian tour at Swinburne University, Meghan appeared wearing pantyhose. This is not a devastating revelation, but it is a small and precise example of the pattern that critics have identified throughout the tour and throughout Meghan's public career more broadly. The pattern of making public statements about values, authenticity, and personal freedom that are then contradicted, quietly and without acknowledgement, by her actual choices and behavior. What is also worth examining carefully is the broader political and cultural context in which this Australian tour took place. Australia is not a country where deference to celebrity is unlimited or unconditional. Australians have a well-documented cultural tendency toward what they themselves call the tall poppy syndrome, a skepticism toward those who appear to be placing themselves above others, a suspicion of pretension, and a directness of expression that does not sit comfortably with the kind of carefully managed and image-conscious public presentation that Harry and Meghan have developed over years of media training and crisis management. The couple's decision to choose Australia as the location for what was essentially an image rehabilitation exercise may itself reflect a miscalculation, an assumption that the warmth Australians showed toward the royal family during previous tours, and the affection many Australians felt toward Harry, in particular, during his gap year spent partly in the country, would translate into favorable treatment during a visit that was fundamentally different in character and purpose from anything that had come before. That assumption, if it was made, proved incorrect. The criticism that emerged from Australian politicians, commentators, and ordinary citizens during the tour was notable not just for its volume, but for its specificity and its seriousness. It was not the kind of vague cultural hostility that might be expected from a public grown tired of celebrity overexposure. It was targeted, factual, and in many cases legally and politically substantive. The demand that Harry and Meghan pay for their own police security, the formal complaint about the hospital visit, the questions raised in the media about the commercial nature of the tour and the lack of transparency surrounding its funding and organization. These were not the reactions of a public engaging in casual gossip about famous people. They were the reactions of a public that felt it had been misled, that felt its institutions had been used without adequate scrutiny, and that was demanding accountability in terms that could not easily be dismissed or deflected. The question of what comes next is one that those who have been following this story are asking with increasing urgency. Harry and Meghan will return to their Montecito home, resume speaking engagements, brand partnerships, and commercial activities, and continue presenting themselves as humanitarian figures driven by genuine public service. Yet they will face, with growing frequency and intensity, the skepticism of audiences who have watched them long enough to understand the difference between performance and reality. The Australian tour did not create that skepticism, but it deepened it, crystallized it, and produced a set of specific documented examples: the hospital stunt, the clothing website, the consent questions, the contradictory therapy admission, the vision board denial, that will be very difficult to leave behind. Beyond Australia's formal complaint is now on the record. The questions it raises require answers, and the children used as props in a Melbourne hospital atrium remain a reminder, more powerful than any argument, of what is at stake when accountability is absent and image is everything. Megyn Kelly's final assessment of Meghan Markle's Australian performance was delivered with the kind of precision and force that has made Kelly one of the most significant media voices covering this story. She argued that the universal negative reaction Meghan now receives from large sections of the public is not the result of a coordinated media campaign, not the product of racism or misogyny or establishment resentment, and not the consequence of anything that was done to Meghan by forces outside her control. It is, Kelly argued, the entirely predictable result of Meghan's own documented behavior over a sustained period. The bullying of staff members that resulted in more than 24 people leaving her employ in circumstances of visible distress, the leveraging of royal status for commercial gain, the relentless public performance of victimhood that sits in irreconcilable tension with the material comfort and professional opportunity that define her actual life, and the willingness to use vulnerable people, most recently sick children in a Melbourne hospital, as instruments of personal advancement without regard for their well-being or their dignity. The formal complaint lodged by Beyond Australia is, in this context, more than a regulatory filing. It is an expression of a broader and growing conviction among people in Australia and around the world that what has been happening over the course of this tour has crossed a line, that the use of sick children as props, the exploitation of charitable frameworks for commercial purposes, and the sustained campaign of public dishonesty about personal history and personal suffering cannot continue to be treated as merely controversial or merely tasteless. The investigation that Beyond Australia is requesting is one that the hospital, the Victorian health authorities, and the broader regulatory framework governing the protection of vulnerable patients have a clear obligation to conduct thoroughly, transparently, and without deference to the celebrity status of the individuals whose actions are under scrutiny. The children who were lined up in that hospital atrium deserve better. The parents who were not told the full truth about the nature of the visit deserve better. And the Australian public, which has been asked to accept a carefully managed fiction as a substitute for the truth, deserves better too. What Beyond Australia has done by lodging this formal complaint is to ensure that the record reflects what actually happened, not the version curated by a public relations team, not the version amplified by compliant media, but the documented, evidenced, and uncomfortable truth about what took place inside that hospital and what it reveals about the people who orchestrated it.